Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast. We don't have a full podcast episode for you this week. Instead, I want to talk about the recent cuts to climate policy in Canada. In 2024, I traveled to Ottawa with a group of climate change survivors of wildfires and floods and pushed on the government to implement an emissions cap with them on oil and gas corporations, Canada's biggest polluters. I saw government representatives tell climate-impacted Canadians that they cared about climate change. Government said that they were going to enact an emissions cap on oil and gas corporations. Then when that was scrapped, they said industrial carbon pricing was going to be strengthened as a result. And we now know that that wasn't true. I'm going to be going through today a series of reasons why the cuts you've seen to climate policy are not legitimate. There's no defending them. There's no reason that they're a good thing. They are inherently bad for Canada, for national unity, and for our climate, and for green economy jobs. This week, the federal government betrayed Canadian communities impacted by wildfires and floods, and Canadians in general on environmental protection. They gutted the industrial carbon pricing to the point of making it largely useless. They gutted the clean electricity regulations to enable more gas plants to be built, likely to power AI slot machines. Again, there's a difference between those and a sovereign cloud. And they announced plans to deregulate pesticides to such an absurd level, even industry says it was more than what they asked for. Granting, for example, Cabinet the power to overrule a minister who refuses to approve a pesticide or who determines that a pesticide currently in use is too dangerous for the environment. I'm going to go through item by item why all of this is not some pragmatic compromise, and as well talk about some ways you can take action. But it should be clear to anyone watching the bigger picture here, there is no 4D chess being played. There isn't a strategic delay happening, nor some secret renewables plan, and this isn't about keeping the country together. In fact, everything they've done tells those who want chaos they can get everything they want if they just keep getting louder. The two words that would best sum up the recent federal announcements around climate policy cuts would be weakness and lies. Whether the federal government either failed to negotiate a stronger carbon price or simply didn't intend to, it says a lot about their willingness to stand up for Canadians. How much appeasement will we see the US government and US corporations get in general? So far, we're at the point of shipping them gas for their AI slot machines. Increasing our defense spending, as another measure of appeasement, does not seem to have done any good. One thing is for sure. Our government will flood the zone to try to cover it up as much as it happens when they do these concessions. Gutting the clean electricity regulations and industrial carbon price effectively cancelled vital green jobs, as the Energy Mix covered recently. Canada's Clean 50 founder and executive director Gavin Pitchford said federal government climate rollbacks are already undercutting the development of Canada's clean economy. 130 per ton by 2040 will decimate an industry that, all in, across the entirety of the clean economy, is over $200 billion in GDP. The actual gutting of the industrial carbon price is arguably worse than that, as the International Institute for Sustainable Development notes. Details of the Canada-Alberta implementation plan allow for a minimum carbon price of just $110 in 2040, far below the $130 advertised, and far too late to meet climate commitments. There are also concerns about the double counting of credits as a result of the specifics. You can read more about the impact of double counting in the newsletter that I'll link to with links to all of this information and all of the sources you'll need. Does anything about any of this sound pragmatic to you? As our executive director, Gretchen Fitzgerald, put it in our media release in response to these cuts, giving oil companies a pass to pollute shows a lack of understanding that our economy is entirely reliant on healthy, intact ecosystems. Forests, oceans, grasslands, wetlands, and rivers are the real backbone of our economy. Without these life-giving systems, we will not be able to build the Canada we want for our children and grandchildren. Anyone who cares about the pragmatic good would not be scrapping green policy jobs like industrial carbon pricing, nor would they be cutting services like pharmacare that Canadians will need more than ever as climate change and the cost of living get worse. If this is the federal government's approach to one of the most catastrophic issues Canadian communities face, then it is the canary in the coal mine for doublespeak on other vital issues. You can take action. Spread the word about what is happening to environmental policy in Canada, go talk to others about this, and don't let the federal government's zone flooding and false framing of pragmatism work this time. More on how will be in the newsletter. A renewable energy future for Canada will have to happen in spite of federal decisions. That will require communities and people like you to advocate for renewables locally, to ensure power is used wisely, and to oppose gas plants and pointless nuclear projects. Again, you can learn more about that in the newsletter. Call your MP and tell them you see what's happening here and that it will not fool people. You do have power and influence. Government hypocrisy has been accompanied by an arrogant contempt for the idea that people might actually care about the environment. I find that arrogance encouraging. It shows that they're having trouble flooding the zone this time. What does pesticide deregulation, so extreme, even the industry didn't want it, have to do with national unity? So let's go through, point by point, the different arguments being made to try and defend these decisions, these policy cuts to climate policy, and why they're indefensible. Number one, no, relying on the market alone does not mean renewables will be built instead of gas plants, and more gas plants are not needed. We've seen this in New Brunswick, where the proposed Tantramar diesel/gas plant could increase energy bills, lock communities into fossil fuels for decades, and put important ecosystems at risk. When one plant is allowed, others may follow, possibly opening the door to fracking and gas pipelines. It is true, in a global sense, that renewables are outcompeting gas and nuclear at an accelerated pace, but Canada is in a different situation. Despite being only a small part of our economy, oil and gas interests hold a massive amount of influence at various levels of government. Oil and gas corporations are not innocent market actors who only respond to demand. They actively seek to control local decision-making processes to maximize the use of their products. We've seen this already in Alberta, where damage was done to renewable energy growth through various measures that counteract the market advantage of renewables. Oil and gas corporations are more than aware that global demand for their product is going to decline soon. The response will be to try to maximize domestic reliance on gas as much as possible, and now they have the room to do it that these climate policies are gone. The Guardian has a pretty good article on this, and we warned about it repeatedly in our Sovereignty Saturdays podcast. Strong national climate policies were an obstacle to the oil and gas industry, helping to guide our energy course in favor of renewables. With those gone, it will matter more than ever that you promote renewables locally and oppose new gas plants. Canada is gutting the clean electricity regulations to enable more gas plants to be built, again, likely to power more AI slot machines. And again, there's a difference between that and a sovereign cloud. AI companies are great at finding sneaky ways to gain access to power and water needed by communities instead. And the federal government has a dangerously naive approach to AI. Fortune reports that nearly 50,000 Lake Tahoe residents have to find a new power source after their energy source looks to redirect lines to data centers. AI projects like that of Kevin O'Leary are being exempted from impact assessments provincially and making inroads federally. If you want to build more gas plants, then you're clearly not interested in protecting the environment. Battery storage solutions mean we do not need gas plants for quote-unquote baseload power anymore. We can pursue renewables on their own with storage. We had more on that on a recent podcast on the Tantramar gas plant, and on the academics who are arguing that it is completely unnecessary there. The few provisions for renewable energy secured recently as part of the Alberta Pipeline MOU are vague and thus easy to undermine by oil and gas interests. They rest on the idealistic notion that oil and gas interests will play nice, interests who specialize in finding ways to undermine vague policies. And I'm going to use an analogy of a cannon in a little bit to explain this, so stay tuned. The enforcement of those provisions for renewables would again require the federal government to actually levy consequences if they are broken. Given how much the federal government has already caved on the previous commitments to an emissions cap and a strong industrial carbon price, consequences are very unlikely to happen. That's not to mention that beyond the market, we are already subsidizing oil and gas corporations heavily and might be about to help them out even more with that fake sovereign wealth fund that the government announced. Number 2, no. Gutting climate policies to this extent was not necessary for national unity. We've noted before that polling shows strong support for climate action and policies aimed at big polluters across the country, including in Alberta and Newfoundland and Labrador. These cuts were extreme and far beyond what could be justified by national unity. Again, what's worse, they actually embolden those who want chaos by showing them that they can get ever more concessions if they just keep getting louder and louder. This is actually the oldest trick in the book when it comes to eroding democracies. Getting governments to increasingly compromise on values is a tactic that dates back to the early 20th century. Source in the newsletter linked in the description. Let's not forget, people are being sold on pipelines and LNG projects that have no business case here. What happens when those people find out they've been lied to? Fallout will happen, and it could happen sooner rather than later now as a result of the Iran war and the demand destruction overseas that we are seeing for gas and oil demand. It's a good time to remember the fable of the boy who cried wolf. And let's look at the larger picture here too, because a lot of other environmental protections are being eroded by the federal government that have nothing to do with national unity. The federal government are pursuing plans to deregulate pesticides, again to such an extent that even the industry says they don't want it. These are not just minor deregulations that are happening. Separately, you are not a utopian idealist for taking the threat of lawless zones, another government proposal, where corporations can do whatever they want, seriously. As is illustrated by that and by the plans to massively deregulate pesticides, a move, by the way, that even a lot of climate deniers I've encountered would oppose, the health and well-being of Canadians is on the line here. The 40 chess argument is meant to fool us into focusing on a pipeline and a few policies alone, not the wider picture. That trick is the one actual move the federal government has played. Number 3. No, the deal did not strengthen industrial carbon pricing. It has been weakened. And no, we cannot reach net zero by 2050 under these conditions. Saying the federal government strengthened the industrial carbon price because they didn't officially remove it is deeply flawed. That wasn't the assignment. The assignment was an ambitious industrial carbon price to make up for the scrapping of the emissions cap and other climate policies. This is not that. Imagine inviting someone to your house, having them smash all your plates and cups, but then they say it's okay because they'll buy you new ones. A week later, they arrive carrying a single teacup. They then proceed to tell you that you have to be pragmatic about the situation, and tell you that you should thank them for at least having brought a teacup. That's what's happened here. As the Canadian Climate Institute confirms, there is no chance of reaching net zero by 2050 as a result of these policy changes. To quote, "The MOU agreement's unreasonable compromises on industrial carbon markets and clean electricity regulations and the implications for weakening policies in other provinces will undermine emissions reductions and Canada's low-carbon competitiveness." While the MOU agreement promises to make improvements to how the carbon market functions, the announced design changes will not be strong enough to fix market fundamentals and reach the intended effective market price by 2040. That undermines the credibility of the deal. Further, the federal government's plan to put the clean electricity regulations in abeyance without any credible path forward increases policy uncertainty in Alberta and opens the door for more provinces to seek special treatment. That risks locking in more long-lived, high-emissions, gas-fired power, exposing ratepayers to more volatile energy costs, and further stifling growth in Alberta's previously thriving renewable energy sector. Number 4. No, we did not need to be more realistic about climate targets. That's not pragmatism, that's an excuse. One thing that we do know about big polluters is that they love to try to find ways around emissions policies. That's what happened previously on methane, and will continue to happen going forward through various means like the double counting of credits. Industrial carbon pricing can be an effective policy, but it can also be a great policy to hide behind while not actually achieving intended targets because it is inherently more complex to understand. That's why you need other policies around it to make it effective, policies like an emissions cap and clean electricity regulations. It's also why you aim high when attempting to reduce emissions. There will be failures, loopholes will be found by corporations, but you will achieve more for having aimed higher than what you'll get if your targets are weak. Aiming at what's practical on emissions reduction, rather than at a point above it, is a bit like aiming a cannon without accounting for gravity and wind resistance, and then yelling, "Look at how practical I am." Number 5. No, carbon capture and storage is not an emissions solution, not in Norway nor in Canada. It is also dangerous and helps funnel more public money towards oil and gas corporations. As Edward Donnelly wrote last year, Equinor has retracted a claim that it stores about 1 million tons of carbon dioxide annually at its flagship carbon capture project after DeSmog obtained data showing the real figure was as little as 1/10 of that amount. That's not an isolated incident. Carbon capture and storage, or CCS, does not work, doesn't account for downstream emissions, is effectively a way to further subsidize US-owned oil and gas corporations, and, far from just being a false solution, it also comes with a huge risk to local communities. As Ali Haida Ali writes, CCS is incredibly costly and inefficient. It requires billions of dollars in subsidies for minimal emissions reductions. Most products don't even make it off the ground, and a small percentage that do underperform vastly. Behind the greenwashing from the oil and gas industry lies a growing body of concern about the real-world dangers of CCS infrastructure. Transporting the captured carbon requires a network of high-pressure pipelines, which can and have exploded in the past. In 2020, a pipeline rupture in Mississippi sent 45 people to the hospital and required hundreds of people to be evacuated. There are also risks to groundwater aquifers, which could be contaminated if leakage occurs. In Canada, these risks disproportionately impact Indigenous communities. Furthermore, most of the small amount of captured carbon is ultimately used for digging up more oil and gas. Number 6. No, a pipeline does not have a market, but yes, the federal government is serious about it anyway, and yes, they are looking at ways to finance it publicly, at least in part. For oil and gas corporations, none of this is really about a pipeline to the West Coast. This has, from the beginning, been for them about removing climate policies, about having an issue to do that via. But that does not mean the federal government isn't making an honest attempt to build a new pipeline, and it does not rule out the possibility they might go back on their word again and try to publicly fund one. Already, the federal energy minister has said that a pipeline could receive federal financing via the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. That's potentially disastrous for all involved, and there's a link in the newsletter that gets into that. Then, there's the very suspicious Not a Sovereign Wealth Fund they set up recently, which could very well amount to yet another taxpayer money funnel to de-risk oil and gas projects, along with the selling of public assets to de-risk oil and gas projects in a UK-style privatization push, that is. If a consortium of companies does come forward to build a West Coast oil pipeline with the federal government backing it, i.e. using taxpayer dollars to transfer the risk off of those corporations and onto the public, then it will be the public that pays the price in the end. Remember all the claims that a private interest would buy the Trans Mountain pipeline? Well, now the Trans Mountain Corporation and its financial overseer are making a pitch to keep the controversial $34 billion pipeline in government hands indefinitely, as the Energy Mix reports. Apparently, no private interests see the value in it. That news also comes after the T reported that Trans Mountain's profitability could also be an accounting illusion. To summarize, in short, you have a right to be angry about what is happening. The federal government is playing 1D checkers. Playing 4D chess requires understanding the importance of regulation. The importance of regulation is something Ol Hendrickson, who works with us at Sierra Club Canada, has written about before, and I encourage you to read that piece if you haven't already. I also encourage you to check out our Sovereignty Saturdays podcast series, which I'm sorry to say predicted much of this accurately in advance, for tips on taking action. There's a lot to do to push back against all this, but already the cracks in the false framing of pragmatic, practical, and balance are starting to happen. People are waking up to the fact that the abundance the federal government is currently pursuing seems to be more about abundance for the few with the money and not for the many. And that's important because it's not just this issue that is affected by this anti-regulatory approach. The complete inability to contradict wealthy, again, often US-linked oil and gas corporations could cost Canadians billions as the Iran war drives up the cost of living. A new research analysis on that topic, a sequel we don't want from the Centre for Future Work, points out, in a best-case scenario, Canadian consumers would pay an additional $12 billion over 12 months in direct higher fuel costs, $38 billion in extra indirect costs through higher prices and other goods and services, totaling $50 billion in extra costs as oil and gas corporations profit off of this crisis. Events in the Persian Gulf are dramatically affecting our economy because of a policy choice, not laws of economic nature. And we have a resource link which gets into things like price caps and other policy measures that could be put in place to help bring down those costs for Canadians, but are not because of that anti-regulatory approach. We are being sold deregulation in the name of abundance, but what's actually being proposed is nothing more than the same trickle-down economics that already failed in the past. It's being repackaged to us with a grin. Again, it preys on false politeness, false sovereignty, false practicality, false pragmatism, and false balance. When deregulationists talk to you about abundance, they do not mean abundance for you. So again, go spread the word. Please talk to others and get involved. And it's been a lot of me talking. So once again, check out the Environment in Canada podcast episodes for even more on this. You can find them on any platform of your choice. And they also air on CKUT radio every other Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 90.3 FM. You can also find the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network. Great place to find it as well. And you can find Sierra Club Canada at sierraclub.ca. We have other ways to take action on our website, and you can find out a lot more about us there. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media. We're on a bunch of different platforms. Sierra Club Canada was also covered by VOCM, Victoria News, and CBC News about the recent federal policy cuts to climate policy. Do go check it out. Go check out our content, see what you think. Thank you so much for listening. And once again, spread the word.